Thank you all for gathering here this evening. It's a beautiful location, and there's lovely music. And I'm grateful that you all have taken the trouble to fight the traffic of the city to reach here and to be with me this evening. My book, in the context of which I'm talking to all of you, is called Looking Away, and its subtitle is Inequality, Prejudice and Indifference in New India. I felt compelled to write this book because of my deep worry about what we have become as a people and where this is going to take us all unless we reflect. I begin my book by asking a question to myself, that suppose I was reborn and 100 years from now I was a historian writing about India today. How would I describe my country, my beloved India, if I was looking back 100 years from now? And I say that there are two defining features of our times that I would write about. The first of them is inequality with indifference. Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust survivor who is a peace worker. He said somewhere that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And another public intellectual, Noam Chomsky, who visited Delhi just quite recently, had said that he's never seen a country where poverty is so dramatically manifest and visible as India. But he's also never seen a people with this capacity to look at suffering and injustice and to turn their faces away. And it is this capacity that we people of privilege in this country have developed to look at enormous injustice around us in many different ways and to feel no sense of outrage. That deeply worries me. That characterizes to me most of all the times that we live in. I call it the exile of the poor from our conscience and our consciousness. In a sense, if you look at our popular cinema, at least in the 50s and 60s, in the years that I was growing up, our films were about, a farmer struggling to hold on to his land, about homeless people, about factory workers fighting for justice. If you looked at our films today and most of our television serials, you'd imagine that there are no poor people in India today. They've just been erased, and everybody has these designer clothes and lives in designer houses, and in a sense, this obliteration from our consciousness of the large majority of our people. Arundhati Roy puts things sometimes very eloquently, and she says somewhere that there's only one secession movement that has really been successful in this country. We think about the Naga movement and the Kashmiri struggle for Azadi and Manipur and so on. So she said, no, the only successful secession movement in this country is the secession of the middle class from the rest of India. That we've sort of created a kind of stratospheric world of our own in our gated colonies, in our, our children will grow up, they won't be using public transport, we won't use public transport, they'll go in protected cars or air-conditioned buses into these very elite schools. Our cinemas are now separate, the places we shop are separate, the places we have our recreation are completely separate. And if you really think about it, in the way that we raise our young people, probably the only poor people that they would encounter in all their years of growing up are people whose job it is to serve them. But as people who are equal human beings, occupying a common space, those spaces have completely evaporated. They've disappeared. We've erased them. It is this sense of, it's not simply the facts of inequality that worry me. And those facts in themselves are extremely disturbing. It is our ability to, our sense of a normative framework that we have created, in which this inequality is seen as, at least as inevitable, but probably as legitimate, as justified. So, I teach a course at IIM Ahmedabad, and in the first class that I take, I tell my young students there that the first thing that I would really like you to reflect on is of the question, don't think that you are here or I am here because we are the best. Because if 1 billion people in this country had the same life chances that you and I had, at least I won't be here or anywhere. And you'll have to decide whether you would be where you are. So at least let us recognize the difference between privilege and merit. So we have what we have because of our privilege, not because we are the best. And I think that we've lost our ability to make that difference. We feel a sense of entitlement for the life that we live, and we feel completely separated and divorced from people, from the large majority of Indian people who live lives of extreme deprivation even today. Some of my friends, formerly from the IAS and others, say, we don't know what is this poverty and deprivation and hunger that you keep talking about. India has changed. People have changed. Their situation has changed. Surely they have changed. When India became free, the average life expectancy was 37 years. Today it is about 67 years. But the life expectancy of the lowest deciles have not increased significantly. But have things changed enough is what we really need to think about. And just very recently, the results of the social economic caste census came out. And sadly and perhaps typically because of this business about it not being a matter of concern about us, the social economic class census is the largest survey of deprivation that has ever occurred in human history. The scale of it is unparalleled. It's not an estimate, it is a house-to-house survey. And what are some of its findings? Among all rural households in India today, how many households do you think, what percentage of rural households would have even a single person who's a graduate or a postgraduate? You know, our Prime Minister talks about aspirational young people and so on. So, sorry, it's not 8%, not 6%, 3% of rural households is what the SECC has shown us. Just 3%. The percentage of households where everybody above 25 is illiterate is about a third of rural households still. The number of households where there isn't a single person who earns more than 5,000 rupees a month, 75% of rural households. The number of households where there isn't a single person who earns more than 10,000 rupees a month, 90% of rural households. Is India shining? Does it matter? Do these people matter at all? Number of households which don't have a single acre of land, completely landless, the number of rural households, 56%. There are more households, a greater percent, I mean, even when India became independent, there were more households which owned land than exist today. These 56% people, how do they survive? They survive on any kind of work that they can find. Jan Bremen, who's one of the finest labor anthropologists that we've had, who's been looking at labor over many decades in India, he calls them, he uses a very evocative, he calls them footloose labor, but he uses an even more evocative term for these 56% people. He calls them the hunters and gatherers of work. People who will look for any kind of work on any terms in any corner of the country. And so if you go, I was recently in Arunachal and I was seeing, you know, in the deep interiors of Arunachal, there were these young boys, 16, 17 years old, and I would get off my jeep and ask them, somebody's come from Bihar, somebody's come from Jharkhand, just somehow, somewhere, you know, in the, at that young an age, to have to travel thousands of kilometers in, you know, in semi-bonded conditions, paying paid dirt wages. So, the fact that this remains the life of a significant majority of our people. And I'm not talking about, you know, I'm not yet talking even about the people at the bottom of the heap. This is about the mass, the median. The story of the median is this. But for people at the very bottom, how does life really look? Again, you know, I keep, these are some stories that are even not even in my book, but I was just recently inside a jail in Saharanpur in Uttar Pradesh, trying to look at what are called under trial prisoners. Under trial prisoners are prisoners who are in jail not because they are convicted of any crime, but simply because they don't get bail. And today, for every one convict, there are two under trials. Now, this might look like, you know, the injustice of our criminal justice system. But when we look more carefully, it's not people like you and I who are trapped without bail in jail. It's the poorest, it's Dalits, it's Adivasis, and it is Muslims who are disproportionately, highly disproportionately represented in these under-trial populations. So, what is it that traps them is what I was trying to, it's not, as I said, it's not the injustice of the criminal justice system that worries me as much as the unequal injustice of that unjust system. Recently there was a study on the death penalty, where once again they found that people on the death row, the capital punishment that we're seeing, overwhelmingly very poor people, people who had no lawyers, people who were from these most disadvantaged communities. And those are those big crimes. These were young, I sat through the day talking to, a lot of them were Muslim young boys and so on. Why are you here? And, I discovered that, I know, but listening to them, the large majority of them were for three kinds of crime which don't require you to have done anything. They require you to only to be in the possession, allegedly, of something. One of them is the Arms Act. And I have two young colleagues who've been sort of looking at this for the last few months. They were telling me that a knife slightly larger, of a particular size qualifies you for, being charged under the Arms Act. And they went to this thana and they actually found an entire bora full of knives of exactly that size from exactly one company. And whenever they wanted to put somebody in, they would show the same knife. It wouldn't even, and it would go before the same magistrate. The magistrate would see the same knife being produced day after day with a whole range of people and would accept and allow this person to go in. Once they go in, they're too poor to have a lawyer. The legal aid lawyer takes no interest. They spend months inside the jail. The second thing that they're in possession of is in drugs, found in possession. But the third, which I found, which is a relatively new development, is what would you, is to be in possession of cow meat. And clearly, you know which community is going to be found allegedly with cow meat. And the cow slaughter law there can allow you, if you're charged with killing a cow, to actually spend your life in jail. And these young boys, most of them were not even in the meat trade of any kind. They were just simply shown to be in possession of this. Some of them may have actually been in possession, there's no way to know. But if any of us were in this, we'd have got a lawyer, we'd have known what our case is, we'd have got our bail. But these boys are just simply trapped and they stay for months in this situation. And they get more and more desperate. And then they're inducted into crime and they learn various kinds of ways. In the jail, they said that the law says only convicts are required to work. But in practice, the convicts don't work. It is these under trials who come in. And they are put to work, the hardest work, cleaning of toilets, working in the kitchen in hot weather. And then they told me, no, but we can get out when we have to pay X amount of money. So I was naively, for a while, I thought this was some kind of rule that they have. And then I realized that no, it was an official bribe which everybody knew that you had to pay to be freed from the obligation, the illegal obligation to work. So who are the people who couldn't pay that amount? You don't have to guess very hard. And so it is this, I'm just illustrating the kind of, and these are not sort of new discoveries. And we all know, I have a police officer here, we all know, all of us know, and yet there are no changes that we are making in the way the criminal justice system works because we have our escape paths. We have our, this separate space where we will engage with the system. We don't have to worry about government schools because we won't be sending our children there. We don't have to worry about public transport because we don't need to use it anymore. We don't have to worry about how public hospitals work because we don't use them anymore. And I also feel that somewhere when I'm talking about this normative framework within which inequality is considered legitimate and our privilege is seen as our entitlement, where does it come from? We were a very unequal society also after India became free, but in those early decades after independence, I remember in my own childhood, there was at least a certain restraint in the way people of wealth lived their lives. It was considered vulgar to flash to wear a very expensive show of your brand. It was more elegant to have a slightly patched old coat that you were wearing. Your mother would tell you, don't waste food, there are hungry children outside. There was a certain, Azim Premji's wife was telling me once when I was talking about this somewhere. She said she was born in a very rich family, and her parents used to insist on sending her in a car to school, and she'd feel so embarrassed that her classmates shouldn't see her coming in a car, so she'd get it parked 2 blocks away and pretend she's also walking to school. Today, you'd want to show off how expensive and flashy your car is. And when I'm talking about this normative framework, one more fact, Akhil Gupta is an anthropologist who's asked this very interesting question. He asks, how many people die in India of completely preventable causes? People who die for no reason which is justified. I mean, people who die, say, of hunger or lack of health care and so on. And he comes up with a very conservative figure of 2 million. Just to put that figure in perspective, the number of people who died in the Great Bengal famine of 1943 was 3 million. So if we are seeing something like a Great Bengal famine happening among us every day, and the tragedy, the intense human tragedy of preventable hunger. See, I was saying, for the average, the SECC, the median, the SECC tells us what the story is. But then for people at the bottom of the heap, one of the most heartbreaking conversations I've ever had in my life is with a group of Dalit Musahar women who were telling me about the most difficult lesson of all that they have to teach their children. And that is the lesson of how to sleep hungry. And, and I have a daughter, she's now of course older, and, I was just thinking, what would life have looked like to me if I had to teach this most terrible of lessons to my own child? And they said there are many days every month when there's no food. And then the whole family sets out looking for pieces of grain. And the place where they find the most is the undigested dung, undigested piece of grain in the dung of cattle. And I was shocked at that time, but I've read some Dalit autobiographies since, and I find people talk about really growing up eating grain taken out from the dung of cattle. Or when the farmers harvest their fields, some pieces of grain fall. And so that obviously is, you might collect a fistful at the end of a day, and your stomach is still empty. And so they say, you see your child trying to sleep hungry, and what do? So they say when the child is very small, you can't even reason with the child, so you put some wild intoxicants on your finger, you put it into her mouth, and she somehow goes into some kind of slumber. But when the child is older, that is the time when you actually sit the child down and you say, you must learn how to sleep hungry. For the rest of your life, there will be many nights when you'll have to sleep hungry. In a situation in which we have 80 million tons of grain in government warehouses in India. Now, 80 million tons, again, may not make sense to us. Jean Drèze was trying to explain it once, and he said if you put 80 million tons of grain, just those sacks one next to each other in a line, 80 million tons means that you can go from here to the moon, you can come back, and you can go a couple of times around the world. And we've been saying, for heaven's sake, 230 million people sleep hungry. Let's at least distribute this grain. And that's how the Food Security Act took birth. And it was such a contested idea. I remember, when it finally, in a much more diluted form, came to Parliament, the 1 week it was being debated, there were very few people within the political system who had any conviction that this was what we should do. And I found myself before television cameras every night trying to, and I found everybody was angry, including the anchor. And not just the anchor that you're thinking about. And I remember one of these debates, a pretty reasonable businesswoman who otherwise is fairly, she turned around in exasperation and she said, I've made my money because I've worked hard. I've done nothing to harm the economy. Why should I be taxed to feed the poor? And I think at the heart of perhaps why I started writing this book was to answer that question. I said, I'm sorry, the poor work hard, much, much harder. You can't even begin to think how hard they work. They've done far less to harm the economy. And importantly, in a good society, people of wealth and privilege are happy to share some of it to make life more fair, more bearable to those who have nothing. But the fact that we are having this conversation on national television with middle class rage, you see, there's been a kind of an inversion where it is the rich and the middle class who are feeling persecuted today. We have these corrupt, useless governments who do nothing, and then they tax us, and then they give all these freebies to bribe the poor into voting for them. That's one scenario that we've built. So why should I be taxed to feed the poor? Of course, we don't even acknowledge that we get at least 3 to 4 times subsidy, all of us, than any poor person gets. Most of those conversations we have in air-conditioned halls, which are with highly subsidized electricity to start with, and so on. And we drive our diesel SUV cars, and we, much of our education, in fact, most of our wealthy people with our IITs and IIMs and All India Institutes, all of them are actually the biggest subsidy receivers in this country. But those subsidies are fine. But when, and you call that, but these you don't even call them subsidies, you call them freebies. And so we define them in a certain kind of way. But the idea is of that undeserving poor person. And one more example of what life is perhaps like for the most disadvantaged. And, working with homeless people, I remember the first shelter for homeless people homeless women that we had opened about 10 years ago. I remember sitting down with the women and saying, what has changed most in your life? And once again, this one woman said something I'll never forget till my last day. She said, for the first time in 17 years, I can close my eyes at night and be sure that no one is going to rape me through the night. The men in this room, in this gathering, will never know what it is to be raped. But even the women in this room, in this gathering, one act, God forbid, of this kind, and our life is scarred for life. What would life look like if 17 years have passed? And they talk about, even if you're sleeping under this plastic sheet, the men come with a knife, they tear that open. Sometimes you have a male partner who's sleeping and is helpless, and he watches while I'm being raped. No one is ever going to, if I go to a police station, I'm considered, destitute. We were looking at homeless deaths and found that the police actually, because you have to keep a record, it's very interesting. The law requires you to actually have inquests, etc., when there are natural deaths. But they have a category which they call beggar type. So and they actually write beggar type, which means you don't even deserve an inquest. And so there is this world that we have constructed, and there's no outrage. I was speaking in New York University 1 or 2 years back to a group of students on homeless people. And I had next to me one of the finest, there's a very fine, very much loved professor called Kim Hopper, who also works with the homeless. And he said, when he was responding to my talk, he was saying that over 30 years he's been teaching his students. He asks them, how did your parents first introduce you, explain to you about the homeless? You see, when a child is driving down the streets of New York and sees people living completely unacceptable lives, surely a child will recognize that something is sort of grossly wrong. And he said that the biggest thing that they remember is that a parent would sort of like take the child and sort of do this gesture as if communicating that these are people who are dangerous people out there from whom you have to be protected. I then started asking, I teach in a few places, I started asking my students, what did your parents say? I mean, for a child here, it should be even more distressing. You see a child exactly your age, knocking on the window of the car and begging, it's pouring rain, and the child is out there. Surely the natural thing that a child should feel is great distress. And interestingly, most of them have no memories. And I think what we teach our children is to turn our faces away, to feel no emotion, to have a sense that this is the way things are and should be. Sometimes in our own homes, you tell I think that you tell a 4-year-old boy, "Bete, sab badon ka ke paon chuo." I wonder how that little boy of 4 knows that sab badon mein the domestic help is not included. He won't go and touch the servant's feet. He knows that this is one adult you can speak rudely to, you can command, and it's all right. We've taught that child the normalization of inequality. And so that is the first feature of and what occupies the first part of my book. But there is a second feature of our times that I also talk about, and that is what I call the legitimization of prejudice. In the middle class, I'm sure, again, when I was growing up, we did carry prejudices against Muslims, against people from the Northeast, against people of dark color from Africa. But people would be very embarrassed to display those prejudices. Today I find, I'm frightened of very few things, but what really gives me a bit of a panic attack is if I have to go to a social gathering, of former colleagues, friends, people I've grown up with in college, extended family, because I'm sure to encounter somewhere along the conversation, and because I'm seen as somebody who's taken a position on Gujarat and so on, there's a greater chance that this will be done. You hear the most extraordinary ill-founded prejudices that homogenize the entire Muslim community as this community which has somehow got an exclusive history of violence, which continue to be sympathetic to violence today, which are regressive, which have 4 wives, and the most absurd recent construction of the idea of love jihad, the idea that that should it should be such an absurd idea, that the idea that good-looking Muslim boys are carefully picked out and trained in madrasas to attract Hindu girls, and Hindu girls have nothing in their heads, and they sort of just it's like those deodorant ads that you see in television, where you have to put on the deodorant and all the girls start. So obviously we teach them something very special in the madrasas, and then they attract these Hindu girls, and then they convert them, and they produce many babies from them, and all of this kind of thing. And but all of these, and so the second part of my book actually reflects on each of these prejudices, and I try to address how irrational they are, how far from fact they are. Just for example, the idea that which of us hasn't received